We're live. Excellent. Well, great to be back with you on Wednesday night and continuing our conversations on the life of Jesus. And tonight, as I joked with Bob, we're going to start the life of Jesus. I was getting teased a little bit about that because we've been at this for now 4 or 5 weeks and Jesus hadn't come up yet. So, but we are actually going to look specifically at the Gospel of Mark. I shared last week that the traditional compositional order of the Gospels is Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. And I tend to believe that and will go along with that order as we go through them that way. And I don't really have any agenda time-wise, so we can go as slow or fast as this takes us to get through the Gospel a little bit. I slowed down a little bit from how quickly I've done it before, and so we'll see where we're going. On that, before I start, I should say, you'll probably get a notification through the church soon once we have a little more information. But some of you already know Tom Jackson passed away this week. His son Lyle called to let us know that, and so the arrangements are forthcoming, but wanted to let you know about that. I don't remember exactly how old he was. Does anyone remember how old he was? I want to say in his 90s, but I don't know exactly. Yeah, okay. All right, well, let us start going through the Gospel of Mark. I'm going to say this just about every time. No, I'm going to say this every time. The Gospels in the Bible are anonymous. We have no idea exactly about the authorship. Neither Mark nor Matthew even give us a hint or any claim. Luke and John have 2 verses in them that might give us a clue to an association, but they never actually say, this is who wrote the gospel. As I mentioned last week, it's fascinating to me that the canonical gospels are all anonymous, and all the non-canonical gospels are proud to tell you who wrote them. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, all of those have names in them, but the canonical gospels, no allusions, no clues. I have heard someone, and I don't even know who said it originally, say that it apparently was the author's belief that no one could take credit for the gospel of Jesus Christ. They are simply relating the story. And I don't know if I say it on this slide or the next one, I say it on the one after this, that the way that the Greek manuscripts, even when the tradition started to be associated with these books, Matthew and Mark and Luke, they did not say the Gospel of Mark. They say the Gospel according to Mark. All of the Gospels have it phrased that way. It's not just a simple possessive genitive. It's the Gospel according to Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. So the Gospel is God's, it seems, and no one's going to take credit for that as we go through it. That said, Mark is a traditional association with this book. It's also one of the most common Roman names in the first century. So which Mark are we talking about here? Well, tradition says John Mark, who is listed in Acts as a traveling companion of a traveling companion of Barnabas, briefly a traveling companion of Paul. He left the trip early, and so when Barnabas wanted to take him again, Paul didn't want him to go, and that actually was the reason that Paul and Barnabas got new partners and did 2 different mission journeys, because John Mark went with Barnabas and Paul went on with Silas. But is it John Mark? Okay. I mean, this is what I've mentioned before. There's this tradition among the church that every time you have a name, everybody who has that name is the same person, right? So John is John of the Gospel, John of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and John of Revelation. And, Mary is Mary Magdalene or Mary, the mother of Jesus, everybody wants to locate this. John Mark is John Mark, who wrote Mark and also was the traveling companion of Paul and also attended him in 2 Timothy. And is it? I don't know. Maybe it could be a first century tradition. Go ahead, Nancy.
Did you just say that John, though, those are distinct?
John Mark is different than John. John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, John Revelation. Maybe those are distinct. Maybe those are the same. I don't know. The book of Revelation says John. He says John on Patmos wrote that. But we have authorship in Revelation. We don't have it in the gospel. There's some similarities in the language in those 2 books. And I will say Revelation is more like John than it is any other book in the gospel. That said, there are some big differences between the 2 that make us go, is it the same person? I don't know. Maybe. So at the end of the day, I say I don't know a lot. I'm sorry. But if God is the ultimate author of this text, it shouldn't cause us too much heartburn, I don't think. The very first written testimony comes from a church father named Papias. Unfortunately, Papias's primary text has been lost to time. We don't have the text he wrote. We have the 4th century text by a church historian named Eusebius, who tells us about the 1st century text and has excerpts from it. So it's reconstructed in the past. Not long after Papias is dated, there are a couple of other sources that mention Mark as the author of this text. So, I mean, it is well attested in the 2nd and 3rd centuries that Mark is a name that is associated with this gospel. And so I say Mark because church tradition has done that for years, and it's the way we can refer to it, and we know what book we're talking about. Is that who wrote this? Maybe. Papias says, this is what the elder said, Mark, who became Peter's interpreter, accurately wrote, though not in order, as many of the things said and done by the Lord as he had noted. Several issues of translation there. What do we mean by interpreter? Do we mean translator? Do we mean stenographer? How much is the intermediary here? Is he taking dictation or is he just telling stories? I don't know exactly. And also, when it says not in order, it is true that some of the order in Mark disagrees with the order in John, but I don't think that this word here means chronology. I think here and in Luke, when it's used, it's a rhetorical word. It's a word that is used to describe a way of telling stories. An educated, orderly, it's almost a genre term. Not exactly, but almost. It would almost be like, trying to think of a good parable. It would almost be like, I wrote an article, not academically, but so I mean that kind of word academically conjures with it, footnotes and thesis statements and peer review and that sort of thing. In the academy you have popular writing and academic writing, and those are two sort of styles. You could maybe think of it that way, right? That Mark is telling this story. But if you're going to look for someone who's been trained in rhetoric, Mark's not your guy. He's not telling it in an orderly way. He's not telling it the way an academic would. And in fact, that was Luke's main objection. That's what Luke says is the philosophy for writing. Many have undertaken to write this, but I decided to write an orderly account, he says. So all these other people have tried. I'm going to tell one that's orderly. And Luke is the height of rhetoric in his argumentation. His work is great. No, it does not. It means it's style. Oh, it means style. It is style. It's that same word that is being used, I think, here. That is, it's almost a criticism, but
is it not?
It's not. It is not chronology. Yeah, it's not an order, as in he told it this way. It is. I want to say it's almost it would only be an insult if you're Luke, I think, right? It's like two academics saying, well, it's popular writing, as though popular writing was a negative in that regard, right? So Mark is popular writing, Luke is academic. Luke is orderly, Mark is not orderly. And it's true, Mark's Greek is terrible. It's really not great Greek. There are times when very simple conjunctions are being used, times when a participle is being used as a finite verb. One of my favorite bits of comparison is whenever Mark is quoted by Luke, Luke changes the grammar so that it's more elegant, which just, I just have this image of Luke going, oh, that is no way to say that. That is, But you see the personalities come in that double and triple tradition when they share those stories together. So is it Mark? Is it, Mark is fine. How important is authorship is a question. I've shared it's not real important. It may give us some help from some context. We might be able to hear text a little bit better if we know this is a person who is from Rome, who is writing in about 70 and they're dealing with these issues. That can give us some sense of it, but it wasn't important to the author. And I think that's worth listening to. Right? The author didn't think their name on it was important, and the church didn't think that their name on it was important because the church brought them into the Bible without a name on them. The church put the names on them. So the church liked the 4 anonymous ones. It didn't like all the named ones. So to me, it's not that important. This author doesn't claim that this is his or anyone else's eyewitness account. There's never a discussion of sources. And I mentioned this before. More precisely, it doesn't say of Mark. It says according to Mark, according to Matthew, according to these. So.
But what is the difference of the of versus according?
The of would sound like it's Mark's gospel,
Okay.
all right? As opposed to this is the gospel according to Mark. In other words, as the way Mark tells the gospel story of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus Christ is the opening line. And so this is not the gospel of Mark, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Mark, I think is the implication there. Yeah, it's not simple possession. Okay, I was talking a lot. Other questions? I get wound up, you know. Okay. Stop me if I get too wound up. When? No idea. Don't know exactly when it's written. Earliest tradition claims it was written after Peter's death in the mid-60s. That's the date I'll go with. That's the traditional date of that. There are some who say it was written in as early as the 40s. That seems a little early to me, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. It is remarkable to me how well the gospel writers, in telling the story, do not necessarily reveal what decade they're in. You know, it's hard for you to not reveal your context and the vocabulary you use and the subject matter you talk. But they don't do that. The situation in the Gospels does a better job reflecting the 30s than it does the 70s in ancient Roman Palestine, which I think very impressive. And for me, an indication of how faithful they were to their sources in the way they told the stories. Yes, Bob?
So the source is written in Greek, the earliest source that we have.
The earliest source is likely written in Greek, yes. There are other possible sources that may have been Aramaic. There are places in the book of Matthew that suggest they could be translation. So they could have been, his sources could have been Aramaic, his sources could have been Greek. It may be that Mark was Peter's interpreter and Peter's telling the stories in Aramaic and Mark's writing them in Greek. And maybe that's what they mean by that. There's more that we don't know than we do know about a lot of this. Yeah, please, Nancy. That hand was raised with such authority. That one really got you. What is it?
So why name them at all?
Tradition. It was a church tradition that came along. Yeah.
What was the tradition?
Why name them?
Oh.
Yeah. It was just this, people wanted to know, well, what is, it was traditional for books to have names. Usually the name of a book came from the first line of the book. That was a traditional way of naming ancient documents. But it's just a way to illustrate what it is and how do you talk about it. Yeah, Bob?
Another footnote, Peter's death is dated by what?
Peter's death is also dated by tradition. Yeah, you're not wrong to bring that up. Yeah. Tradition says he was killed in the Neronic persecution in Rome, but it's not told in Scripture, so we don't have anything to know beyond that. Some suggest Paul was killed then as well. I think there might be a case to be made that Paul might have survived a little past that first persecution and die a little bit later. But this story's not about Paul. We're going to try and tell Mark's story. So I don't have a problem dating it anytime, but for convention's sake, I kind of go with popular interpretation and say Mark is 60s, Matthew 70s, Luke is 80s, John is 90s, giving some wiggle room across the decades there. So, okay. Where was it to? Well, stop me if you've heard this. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly. It is often said that it was written to the church in Rome. And Mark certainly does use a lot of Latin loan words without translating them. He uses a word for the widow's mite, that coin. He uses the Latin word for that coin. He uses a Latin word for something else I can't recall now. That he used a Latin word for. I think there's about 5 or 6 words that he's using from Latin. And so I said, well, Rome, that's probably where it's from. And I would go, okay, but the Roman Empire is pretty darn big, and I bet they know what those coins are called everywhere, So I don't know if we can say for sure it was written to Rome. But the other side of that argument, before I get too snooty, is to say there's a whole lot easier case to make it Rome than there is any place else. If you want to try to say it was written in Egypt or even Palestine, that's a harder argument to make, because he explains Jewish customs, he translates the Aramaic. You don't have to translate the Aramaic if you're writing it in Palestine. And the explanation of Jewish customs doesn't make sense. He's writing for an audience unfamiliar with Judaism. So Western Turkey, okay, but there's no reason to think Western Turkey is any better choice than Rome at that point. So I don't know. It could very well be an encyclical. An encyclical is just a word that is for an open letter. It's written for a broad circulation. It may very well be. It may have been, the idea was, I'm going to write a general story of Jesus Christ that can be shared. And so maybe that's who he was aiming for. Hard to know. Yeah. See, all of these things I think would help us hear some of the stories a little better, but so much of this is just speculation. And so you'll hear me say, if it's written in Rome, we can hear it this way, But tradition says Rome. I'll go with Rome because, like I said, it's harder to make the argument for any place else, even though it's not necessarily easy to make it in Rome. All right, anything on the introductory material? Okay, let's talk about the text itself. The text really does divide into two sections pretty well. The first half of the book is who is Jesus, and that is all taking place on a journey to Caesarea Philippi. That Caesarea Philippi is as far north in Israel as you can go and still be in Israel, basically. The traditional locations of Israel was Dan to Beersheba, and Caesarea Philippi is in the very north, and which is why I keep raising my hand. That's why that was an instinct there. So I'm pointing on the map. Can you see the map in my head that has me in the north here? Anyway, Caesarea Philippi is right next to Dan in the north. It is has lovely, lush growth in that area. The water, number of springs, one of the three sources of the Jordan River come from Caesarea Philippi and Dan. And the water is usually melted snow off Mount Hermon, so it's ice cold all year round, very clear. Lovely, lovely. The whole thing's a nature preserve now. So there's exotic birds and animals as you go through. And it's unusual because I take the students there and they'd be like, Dr. Wallace, when are we going to see something I saw a picture of in Sunday school? Because this does not look like my Sunday school literature. This looks like the jungle. But it is. It's way up in the north. This is where we get, when we get to this section here, the 8:30, this is the who do you say that I am section. Right? Who do they say that I am? Well, who do you say that I am? And after we get Peter's you are the Christ, then we start the journey to Jerusalem. So that journey starts from as far away from Jerusalem as you can be and still be in Israel, and then they start moving in time. In the synoptic, in Mark, like all the synoptics, there's one trip to Jerusalem, the one that mattered. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is hopping in and out of Jerusalem all the time. I mean, it's at least 3 visits in John. But in the synoptics, there's one trip, the one that really mattered. Yeah. And most of this material is the last part of Jesus' life. About a third of the book is the last 24 hours. So it's just a real passion ending on that. So, questions about the organization? I had someone say once that the Gospel of Mark would make a great movie script because life moves pretty fast in the Gospel of Mark. Over 40 times in the Gospel, Mark uses the word immediately, or as the CEB uses it, at once. Things are always happening quickly. And immediately, Jesus went out, and immediately the Spirit drove him here, and immediately the woman was healed, and immediately things are happening quick. He always connects his sentences with and. Just that's how it is. There's no sophisticated conjunctions here. And then, and, just one right after another. It is the shortest gospel of all the 4, and though here's the ironic part of this, it is the shortest gospel of all the 4, but when it tells a story that is in the other gospels, it's always the longest version, which is fascinating. So it has less stories, but when it tells them longer and sometimes with more detail. Sometimes it doesn't have more detail. Sometimes it just has more words, but sometimes it has more detail. He gives us the blind man on the way out of Jericho's name was Bartimaeus. And I think if I recall in Mark, it's, and Jesus went into Jericho and on his way out. So it's just like, wow, that was the whole story. We just walked through Jericho, and on the way out of Jericho, he ran into the blind man. So, okay, things are moving quick in Mark. But it does give that sense of, I don't know, it just gives a sense of movement as you go through. A lot of action. All right.
What did you mean by double or triple?
The double tradition and the triple tradition. I mentioned that last week. Double tradition, and I shouldn't have used it here. I should have used triple tradition. Double tradition is when something is shared in Matthew and Luke, so it doesn't apply in this context. Yeah. Triple tradition is when it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Sometimes Mark and Matthew agree, sometimes Luke and Mark agree, but there's no words for that. I just wasn't thinking when I did the double there. That was on me. So I confused those terms. So, but yeah, triple tradition is just, it's in all three Gospels. Yeah, feeding of the 5,000.
There are a couple of stories that get all four.
That's right. Feeding the 5,000 gets all four. Yeah.
But not very many.
No. Well, that's good. I mean, John just has so much different. It's hard. I mean, it's funny because you would think the baptism of Jesus would be in all four, but John doesn't have Jesus being baptized. He has John the Baptist baptizing, but Jesus isn't baptized in John. They talk about baptism a lot. And it gun to my head until a couple years ago, I'd have gotten that wrong on a trivia question, because I was sure Jesus was baptized in John. I mean, of course he was. I read John. Of course he's baptized in John. No, he's not. You can go through there. He's not baptized. They talk about the baptism, and John says, "Behold, the Lamb of God. I'm not worthy to untie his." It does the whole, Jesus is great, but you don't get the baptism. So, totally missed that. Until more recently than I care to admit. So, all right. So let's look at the beginning. The beginning of the good news, remember the gospel of Jesus Christ, or about Jesus Christ, God's Son, happened just as it was written about the prophecy of Isaiah. So this is all one sentence. A lot of times they put a period there. The Common English Bible puts I'm doing CEB in our study tonight because we haven't used the CEB much. And a lot of times looking at a different translation can evoke some things that we didn't otherwise see. So I thought I'd use these a little differently this time. So let me read this sentence right. The beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, God's Son, happened just as it was written about in the prophecy of Isaiah. So that's the sentence. Look, I am sending my messenger before you. He will prepare your way. A voice shouting in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make his path straight. Let me finish that real quick and then we'll talk about it. John was in the wilderness calling for people to be baptized to show that they were changing their hearts and lives and wanted God to forgive their sins. Everyone in Judea and all the people of Jerusalem went out to Jordan River and were being baptized by John as they confessed their sins. John wore clothes made of camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist. He ate locust and wild honey. He announced, "One stronger than I am is coming after me. I'm not even worthy to bend over and loosen the strap of his sandals. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." So, important to note, we know the whole story right now. We know that Jesus Christ is God's Son. We know Jesus is the Christ, and we know Jesus is God's Son from the very beginning of the story. This is important because nobody else does. And we know that this is an old story. It happened just as was written about in the prophecy of Isaiah. Forgot to double check, but if my memory serves me right, this is the only Old Testament quotation in Mark, is the one at the open. And it is said to be in the prophet Isaiah, from the prophet Isaiah, which is very close. It is, partly, from the prophet Isaiah. These two stanzas here, "Look, I am sending my messenger before you. He will prepare your way," is from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. This part, however, is not. Does anyone know where that's from? That sounds like me. That is from Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. A voice shouting in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make his path straight. So, why the conflation? I don't know, but I've always thought it was interesting. I had someone point this out to me as a reason not to believe the Bible. Mark says Isaiah, but it's Isaiah and Malachi. And I said, guess it just doesn't bother me that much, but really bothered him. It's hard not to imagine, this would be a traditional, and I use the term rabbinic even though it's a little bit anachronistic to use that term in this way, but it would be a common tool to show how well you can navigate with the scriptures and combine them in interesting ways to make your point. And so the fact that the opening verse is from Isaiah and the bottom one is from Malachi and he presents it as it's all from Isaiah, that is a 21st century and American problem if you have a problem with that. The first century reader is not going to have a problem with that. They're going to think, oh, look at that, he's trying to do it with Malachi. Good job. How about that? I mean, it wouldn't be that dramatic even, but bothers folks. Bother anyone here? No? Not after that little lead up, it's not going to bother anybody here. I tell you, once you get comfortable saying I don't know, it's a lot easier to read the Bible. That's all I'm saying. I don't know. Going to trust God on this one. As I say, the reader knows Jesus' identity. The characters in the story do not know Jesus' identity. The characters do call him Messiah. God proclaims Jesus as God's son at his baptism. I'm not sure who hears that. We'll look at that in a second. Clearly Jesus hears that, but I don't know if anybody else in the crowd hears it in Mark. In Luke, I think other people hear it, but in Mark, I don't know. At the Transfiguration, it is addressed to the disciples. This is my son, listen to him. So they hear him there. The demons call him Son of God several places. The only human being to explicitly call Jesus Son of God is the Roman centurion at the crucifixion. As I have pointed out before, there are other foreign people, other non-Jews in the story that demonstrate a belief in Jesus being more than just Messiah, though they never verbalize it. The Syrophoenician woman, I think, is one of those. The Gerasene demoniac, who in my life I have learned to call Gary, because I just like calling him Gary, the Gerasene demoniac. He confesses that because Jesus says, go tell them what I have done for you, and he went and told them what the Lord had done for him. And so you see him equating Jesus with God in the way in which he tells his testimony there. But the only explicit confession is the Roman centurion at the crucifixion, which is, by the way, another reason people located in Rome for composition, is because the Roman is the hero at the cross. So, yeah. Jesus is misunderstood by everyone else. The religious authorities don't get it. His own family doesn't get it. His hometown tries to kill him. He couldn't even they don't try to kill him in Mark, but he can't do any great miracle there. And his disciples on numerous occasions do not understand regularly. And he often says, are you so dull? In many translations. And of course he calls Peter Satan, so that's rough. That's not a great way to go. So let's continue on. About that time, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and John baptized him in the Jordan River. While he was coming up out of the water, Jesus saw the heavens splitting open and the Spirit like a dove coming down on him, and there was a voice from heaven, you are my Son, whom I dearly love, in you I find happiness. So who sees all that? Who hears all that in Mark? It appears to be an audience of one there. I mean, it said Jesus saw heaven splitting open. And the Spirit coming like a dove. So at least in Mark, I don't know, it's a secret. I don't know. This is, by the way, another combination, the Psalm and a passage from Isaiah as well. It's not explicitly listed as one such, but this is Psalm chapter 2. And then the In whom I'm well pleased, I can't remember exactly which one that one comes from. But at once or immediately, the Spirit forced Jesus out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan. He was among the wild animals, and the angels took care of him. So that's it. That's the story of the temptations of Jesus in Mark. Right? He gets baptized, and the Spirit throws him in the wilderness. He was tempted there, by the way. Angels gave him food. And then, after John was arrested, that's it. That's the whole story. We're just moving through. We're focusing on the highlights of Jesus' life. Don't have time for the backstory. That's in the extended edition. Just the McNuggets. After John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee announcing God's good news, saying, now is the time, here comes God's kingdom, change your hearts and lives, and trust this good news. Anything there you want to talk about or see? Yes, please, Anne.
Last Sunday in animal class, we studied Jesus' baptism, and then someone asked a question, if only Jesus heard that
Right.
my son, and how they recorded, how they know it. But we didn't, nobody had an answer.
Well, I can cheat on that, right? And say, Jesus. Anna was just asking that they'd mentioned this in Sunday school and asked the question that if Jesus is the only one who heard this, who wrote it down? Who knew to write it down? And the cheat, easy answer on that is, well, Jesus told him. So that's the That's the easiest way I have to answer that. But I mean, if again, these texts are inspired by God, God can work in any way God wishes to call these things to mind. Yeah. Good, sir.
Is this, again, timeline consistent across the others in terms of when Jesus started preaching? This says
After John was arrested, yeah. Matthew and Luke, I think, both begin. Thank you, Bob. Yes. Is the timeline consistent for the way in which Jesus begins preaching? Because it mentions after John was arrested, Jesus, and they are consistent in that regard. Yes. Most the synoptics both follow the very same outline. Jesus is baptized. He has a Galilee ministry. He's baptized. He's tempted. He has a Galilee ministry. He gets to Caesarea Philippi and asks, "Who do they say that I am?" He starts one trip to Jerusalem. Passion Week, it all follows that same outline. John is completely different in that, and for that reason, some say John didn't know the story of the synoptics, which I think is ridiculous. How are you writing the story of Jesus in 90 and you've never heard anything about any Jesus? No, he's playing with these stories. He's reinterpreting them in provocative ways to help them get to the truth of the story in ways that, and we'll talk about that when we get to John. I'm sorry.
As familiar as the text is, I think something you said earlier is surprising me, that all of these verses we're looking at right now are in northern Israel.
These verses?
Yeah?
These are not in northern Israel yet.
Oh,
No.
I thought that's what you told us.
That is the where the who do you say that I am? That's the break in the book. So 1 through 8 it is Jesus goes north. And then he gets to Caesarea Philippi, and then from that moment on, he heads south.
Okay.
So he's over on one side of the lake. He goes north. He's on this side of the lake. He's on that side of the lake. But he keeps, he wanders, but he's going at the end north in this. Yeah, no, thank you for pointing out where I missed it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all this is, but the Galilee, technically the Galilee is in the north. So yeah.
I read all of that in a different way, and
right.
It just threw me off for a second.
The Jordan, where Jesus is being baptized, it is north-south. It's a north-south river. That is correct. From the Hebrew word yirad, to go down, because the elevation goes down. But the traditional site of Jesus' baptism would be 15 miles from Jerusalem. So it'd be pretty easy to pop out and see what John is doing. Yeah, you were right. And John's unusual diet and way of dressing would resonate with some of I mentioned before, the Essenes, the Jewish sectarian groups that lived not far from where he's baptizing traditionally. So I'm not saying John was an Essene, but it at least shows that he's dressing like people nearby, if nothing else. I think there's some case to be made for that.
Not to make too much.
Please.
But you said the traditional Jesus baptism
Right.
was 15 miles?
About 15 miles from Jerusalem, yeah.
So he had moved from Nazareth
Correct.
to Jerusalem.
Well, we can't say that in the synoptics. It screws up the story, Bob.
You can't say what?
He can't say that. He just said that he went from Nazareth to Jerusalem because the baptism site's 15 miles from Jerusalem. I would say probably that is the way the road goes, and that is the natural belief in that. But you're screwing up a good story if you highlight that in Mark. John thinks that's exactly the way it went, but you screw. It's kind of like how in John, Jesus is on the shore after the resurrection making fish while the people are fishing. Well, he's on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is in the north, right? But in Luke, none of the resurrection appearances are outside of Jerusalem. His road to Emmaus, the locked room, that's it. We can't have Jesus appearing in the Galilee because that screws up what Luke is doing in Acts, which is to say that you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. Got this really cool concentric circle thing going with Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. And if you're in the Galilee, it screws up the story. So no resurrection stories in Galilee. We're gonna have him there. Yeah, but I think he probably went to Jerusalem more than once. But for Mark, it's the only one we're talking about is the trip to Jerusalem. Yeah, absolutely. I love, here comes God's kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is at hand is the way it's normally translated, but here it comes. Nice translation there. There's a translation coming. We're probably not going to get to it tonight, but it's one that we can fight about, I think, because I'm not sure I'm happy about it, but I know why they did it. But you'll have to go with me on it. We'll have to have that conversation. So, all right. Jesus and his followers went into Capernaum. So this is still in the north. This is on the eastern shore of the lake. Immediately on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and started teaching. The people were amazed by his teaching, for he was teaching them with authority, not like the legal experts. Suddenly, there in the synagogue, a person with an evil spirit screamed, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One from God." "Silence," Jesus said, speaking harshly to the demon. "Come out of him." The unclean spirit shook him and screamed. Then it came out. Everyone was shaken and questioned among themselves, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He even commands unclean spirits and they obey him." Right away, the news about him spread throughout the entire region of the Galilee. After leaving the synagogue, Jesus, James, and John went home with Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed, sick with a fever, and they told Jesus about her at once. He went to her, took her by the hand, and raised her up. The fever left her, and she served them. So I'll stop there real quick. It's not very nice. This woman just got over an illness, and we're making her work. I mean, that's just, what kind of cruelty is that? Okay, this is, again, cultural, right? She is now not just healed, she is restored socially. Now, we can question just how right it is that that is the role that she has in society, but Jesus has allowed her to live into that role, which she couldn't do while she was ill. So, and the natural assumption, if Simon has a mother-in-law, is that Simon is in fact married, which we don't talk about it a lot, but I have asked Catholic friends who have had a good laugh about that the first pope, traditionally Simon Peter, was in fact married. So, just an interesting fact of history there. That was, of course, before he got to be pope. So, if he'd have known. So, anyway. We have several healing miracles in the beginning of Mark, and initially, the questions are sort of internal questions. That who is this? This new command. Nobody's addressing that to Jesus at this point. And later on, even on the Sabbath, when he's challenged, they said among themselves, "Who is this that thinks he can?" I mean, so they're not openly. We don't have that open confrontation until a little bit later in the story. I noticed something though that I always thought was pretty cool, and I actually noticed it in real time on the podcast with my friend Mike McKeever when we were talking about this passage. And I haven't seen anybody talk about it anywhere. I Googled it a couple of times and researched a couple of times. And so if I was a New Testament